So I was thinking the last time that we had an anniversary celebration that we made, some fluff over, I was smart enough to get somebody else to preach for me that day. But I was thinking this whole week as I've been looking back, I have this wonderful church history that Ron Hamelberg wrote for us. Thank you, Ron. I know you and Nancy are watching. Thank you so much for this history. I was thinking about a story from my ministry that was a time several years ago. I was called by a nursing home, and they asked me if I would come and be there to perform a vow renewal for a couple who wanted their vows renewed on their anniversary. And I said, well, sure. And, I was thinking in the nursing home, maybe this is a couple that the man or wife had just gone in, and all of a sudden, there was something that was coming up that maybe was dire, and they wanted to renew their vows as a statement of their love before something would happen. But the lady said to me, the folks want to renew their vows on their 72nd wedding anniversary. They were in the same nursing home together. Luckily, they were able to be in the same room together in that assisted living place. And I said, so what kind of, do they want me to just come to the room? And she goes, oh no, we're having a big celebration. Come prepared as you would to do a wedding. And I said, okay, all right. So I got there on the day about an hour before the stated time of the celebration happening. And the lady who I spoke with on the phone met me, and I went down to the bride's room. So they were preparing the bride, and she was in her wheelchair in a beautiful satin wedding gown. And they had a hairdresser come in and fix her hair and put on a veil, one of those veils that hang off the back, that sort of thing. And apparently the man had been taken to another room, a friend's room, and he was being prepared, and he was putting on a tuxedo to wear to his wedding. And it was 72 years that they were renewing their vows for. And so as I was chatting with the lady, she was ready early, and I just had some time to sit and chat with the woman who was going to be the bride in the situation. And I said, so tell me, how does a marriage last 72 years? And she said, well, what do you think? First thought was this lady a therapist in her former life? Because that's what we're trained to do, ask you what you think so we don't have to speak, right? And I said, well, I think it takes love and faith and grit and determination. And she goes, yeah, it takes all of that. And I said, is there something I'm missing? And she says, well, you know what we learned? Because, he was 94 and she was 90, imagine, and that was a few years ago. I don't even know if the couple is still with us today. She said, we had to learn to go with the changes. We had to learn to go with the changes because, things change. And I said, oh, really? Tell me, what has changed in 72 years of marriage for you? I talk with married folks all the time. What changes might I be willing to, or might you be willing to share with me that I can share with other people? And I'm not kidding you. She said to me, have you seen him? And I said, excuse me? She's like, yeah, they're fitting him for a tuxedo. And he doesn't look like he did 72 years ago. She said, you gotta be willing to go with the changes. And I've been thinking about that when I think about St. Paul. We do not look like we looked 158 years ago. We have changed. And some might say we have changed radically. But let me tell you a little bit of something that one of the gentlemen in that picture who was preparing to ring the bell told me about St. Paul, because he had been here since he was a tiny child, and he has since joined the cloud of witnesses around us, Charlie Gilly. I used to chat with Charlie Gilly about changes that had happened here at St. Paul. And do you know, this church met in a school building before it ever had these walls up, because it decided to charter in November of 1863, and there was no church building here. The church building was to be where the cemetery is at. Someone donated, I think it was Hank Sandman, who then also became one of the cops of Barrington Station area. I think he donated that property over there where the cemetery is, 2 acres of it, for this church to be built. And so the people were meeting in a school. They didn't have a church building to be in. They were flexible enough, you see, to meet where the Spirit was calling them to come together, to gather together. And then also, the whole entire group of folks were German immigrants. There was nobody probably that looked like us in our modern wear. They probably all looked like the ones that were all out in front of the church, a church that looked like it was about the size of our church now, right? They were all German immigrants. And did you know that German immigrants did not have a good time in the United States of America? There were some immigrants that came over first in the first wave of German immigration into the United States, and they had gotten things settled, and then there was another wave of German immigrants that came over that moved westward out towards where we are now and even beyond. But the ones who came first and had claimed this country as their own, they were not so happy with those ones that came after them because they called them upstarts and anarchists, and they wanted our jobs. That's what they said. Because in Germany, skilled labor, the tradesmen, the people that could cut out these things on these pews, those were the kinds of things that the new groups were bringing in that had already been established here. And the German immigrants were not nice to the family immigrants that were coming over later because they were coming here as anarchists who were trying to change everything. But these German immigrants, they were called together to build a place where they were safe, where they could worship their God, where they could spend time together in fellowship because they were all German speaking. And not everyone out here in Barrington Station spoke German. And so until I think it was the last German-speaking service that was held here in St. Paul, at St. Paul, was in the 1940s. But they were completely German-speaking here at St. Paul until 1916, when they decided that they would go down to 1 German service a month, which was on the 4th Sundays of the month. Now, I want you to think about that, because remember how sometimes in the church, we get wrapped around the axle, we get wrapped around the nostalgia. That is, I sure wish the church could be the way that it used to be. What if I told you we're going to go to German next week? Do you really want to go back? You see, we had to roll with that change of changing the language here. Or perhaps it is a good guess, it's a good hypothesis that this church would have closed had it not rolled with the change of changing the language that we have here. And Charlie always said to me, we were seen in Barrington, that church, as being the liberal church. We weren't conservative enough for the rest of the churches in town at the time because we gave too much. This church was significant in the starting of Benson, what is now called Bensonville Lifelink. This church was significant in starting what is now called Greencastle, Centegra, what was Centegra and is now Greencastle. This church was significant in the beginning of what is now called the Advocate Aurora Hospital System. It was then, way back when we were beginning in the middle of it, called the Evangelical Hospital System. But you see, we've rolled with those changes, where we've had to become what society needs us to be at the time. And at that time, when Charlie was telling me the story about how this church used to get looked on, frowned upon, looked down upon because we gave too much, this congregation, for its history, has been a congregation of those who were marginalized, those who kept trying, those who had grit and determination, those who realized that what God calls us to do is to be the church leading the way about mission. We're still doing some of those things today, but let me tell you, mission in the late 1800s was a lot different than it is today. Back in the 1800s, when someone was hurting, someone was without food, They would allow folks to come to their home and sit and have a meal with them. Today, when we know that people are hurting, it's probably the way that we're going to respond to throw money at the issue, right? We are not inviting people into our homes. But here's the catch on that whole entire thing. Maybe it was one person in a community that was in need of a meal back then. Now it's tens of thousands of people who need meals. This church, being called to roll with the change that has happened in our society, is struggling and trying to figure out the way we're walking to respond to those changes. As I said earlier, this church survived a lot. In 158 years, they survived the Civil War, right? This church was here before Barrington was a town. Did you know that? Before the state of Illinois incorporated Barrington as a town, this was just called Barrington Station because it was a way-through place. This church was the third church established in Barrington Station. The first church was the Methodist Episcopal Church, which is now Barrington United Methodist Church out on 62. And the second church was the Community Church of Barrington. It was a different kind of Baptist church then, but it was second, and we are third, as the third church established in this town. Imagine if those immigrants, those small amount of immigrants who didn't speak the language of many of the people around them, had not had grit, had not had determination, had not had faith and love, and had not believed that God would lead them through this. Imagine, we may have not seen this church since the early 1900s. Civil War was raging, and in the year that this church was established was 1863. Do you know what happened on January 1st of 1863? The Emancipation Proclamation was signed. So this church was built in a time when the world was reeling, and it survived. I believe, it is my belief, that this church in this reeling time that is happening around us right now is going to survive. And the reason why is because the people who keep coming here, the faces who keep changing us, the people who keep calling us to learn new ways are people who have grit and determination and faith and love. And they're committed to something that is greater than themselves. You see, that group of German immigrants was committed to something greater than themselves. And I can tell you, having been in this business for a little while now, that churches that are not committed to anything but themselves are not churches. They are civic groups, they are country clubs, but they are not places where the gospel is lived out. This church has lived out the gospel for 158 years, or it never would have survived. Let me tell you some of the early problems. They had problems getting pastors here. They had problems getting pastors here because of the fact that they had problems with just the natural, normal things that were happening building a church where there's a lot of, well, I think it should be this way and I think it should be that way. And they had problems with pastors coming here because they couldn't pay their pastors, right? They couldn't pay their pastors. So for 1 year, they took a complete hiatus from being a church. Now that could have stalled everything right there. They took a complete hiatus from being a church because they could not raise enough money amongst them to pay a pastor to come be their pastor here at this church. There was one time in the past when they shut the church down for a month because they needed to raise $38 to be able to turn the heating oil, get the heating oil delivered to be able to heat the church. But you see, there's never been a time when there hasn't been a tough road to hoe here in front of us. We have always been a church that has been faced with challenges, and we have always been a church that has risen up to those challenges. You know, I very proudly, I always tell people, we are the church on the wrong side of the tracks in Barrington, and we like it that way. You know who I got that saying from? Ralph Galke. Ralph Galke always used to tell me how proud he was to be a church from the wrong side of the tracks. He said, all those other churches over there, I could have gone to church over there all of those years, but it was more fun to try and run across the tracks and beat the train before I came to church. And he stood in that lectern one day, and he talked about how one day coming to Sunday school with his only crisp white shirt, it got the dust, the soot from the train engine on it because he was running across so quickly in front of the train that some of the soot fell on his shirt and he was in trouble when he got home. Right? But he always told the story of how he loved being the church that everybody thought as being on the wrong side of the tracks. Charlie Gilly always started to talk to me about how he loved that the church was always seen as a place that was too giving. Right? Others in the past have said to me that they have been so proud of St. Paul United Church of Christ because we've always been seen as the church who was counted out. We were counted out. You know, other churches grew by all this sort of growth that they had. We had enormous growth here in the mid-19th century, but when it started to shrink, council members here had 4 to 6 hour council meetings worried about how they were going to keep the church alive. Do you know how they kept the church alive? Grit and determination and faith and love and realizing that they were a part of something greater than themselves. We look completely different than the church that began here 158 years ago. But that does not mean that we have any less call to be a part of something greater than ourselves. That does not mean that just because we don't look like they looked in the 1800s, we cannot be a church just as significant and as faith-filled and as loving and as giving as this church has always been known to be. But we do have to think about the fact that that was the past, and we are in the future. So some of the things we have to let go. And a couple of the things that I think we have to let go of is one that I've preached about before. I think we really have to get beyond this worry about having enough funding. We have to get past that worry. I'm not going to shut this church down if you can't pay me, okay? I'm not going to allow you to shut the church down if you can't pay me. But I think we have to get beyond that worry, because I could show you years, decades of council documents where the number one worry of this church is whether or not we could pay for something. Do you know, if it hadn't been able to been done, if the church together hadn't risen to that challenge, the doors would have closed. You see, we've always had that worry, but we've always found a way to make it. And the reason why we make it is because we have the grit and the determination of our immigrant settler ancestors to continue to be a part of something greater than ourselves. The other thing that I think we have to challenge ourselves to leave in the past is our attachment to the way it always was. Do you know that if you want it to be the way it always was, men are going to sit on this side? No, men are going to sit on this side because that's where the pulpit's at. Women are going to sit on that side. Men get to face the pulpit. Women have to crane their eyes to see the pulpit. Families did not sit together. The sons would sit with their fathers on this side. The daughters would sit with their mothers on this side. Any ladies here want to go back to that? Any ladies have a real attachment to that from our past? You see, the more that we attach ourselves to the past, the slower we get in moving forward. Because each piece of the past's lineage and baggage that we hold on to that we don't want to part with, we get slower and slower in our momentum. So, me being the person who believes that we are called to something greater than ourselves, me being the person who thinks that this church still has such mighty ministry to do in this world, I believe we can break from that hold, and I believe we can move forward and we can learn to become the church that is needed today. And the only way that we can learn to become the church that is needed today in this very strange society that we are in is to start focusing on what's around us now. And the other component of that is that we've got to make sure somehow that this church is here for another 158 years. So our big challenge as we go into this new year together when Advent starts to come is to think about how are we going to do that? How are we going to be what the church needs today? And how are we going to set the foundational blocks like our ancestors set for us so that we have the determination and the grit and the faith and the love to go forward so that those that we will not even know will be able to stand in this sanctuary or some iteration of it somewhere and say, they built this for us. Amen.